Thank you, Rabbi Kenigsberg. Throughout the last year, it's the Jewish community whose collective and growing voice has been loudest when it comes to highlighting the plight of the Uyghur community and calling out the horrific injustices in Xinjiang. On the streets, by lobbying MPs, in letters to the Prime Minister, and through contacting companies linked to the province or to the upcoming Winter Olympics. This timely event is yet another example of that, and Jewish News is proud to be a partner for it. The Chief Rabbi's voice too has stood out among faith leaders in this country. As he rightly said, we as a community cannot simply stand by in the wake of growing evidence of persecution against another minority. That was why Jewish News first took on this campaign long before it started to receive wider media attention. It was a story about the discovery of a shipment of tons of hair suspected to have come from Xinjiang that was the catalyst for us. We carried that on our front page with the headline, "Chilling Echoes." Not because events in China are comparable to the Shoah, but because our community knows more than most what it's like to suffer persecution. Because those images of the hair do carry echoes in living memory for many of us. And because central to the message of our amazing Holocaust survivors and Holocaust educators is that prejudice and persecution must be stopped when it first appears and never left unchecked. No matter how much condemnation we receive from the Chinese embassy for our coverage, Jewish News will continue to stand squarely and vocally with Rahima, Ian Duncan Smith, Lisa Nandy, Nuskani, and all the others who are standing up in this crucial fight. Thanks to you, Rabbi Kenigsberg, your community at Magen Avot, and the wider United Synagogue community for all the work you have done to put on today's important conference. On behalf of our editor, Richard Ferrer, and I, we hope it leads to even more activism on this crucial issue from within our community.
Thank you. Thank you there. You just heard from Justin Coan from the Jewish News. I want to thank the Jewish News for all their work on this important issue and for partnering with us this evening as the official media partners of tonight's event. We're now going to go into the third and final session, talking about practical consumer protest. Who do we target effectively? And I'm going to hand over to Rabbi David Mason, the Rabbi of Muswell Hill United Synagogue and chair of the Haringey Multi-Faith Network, in order to chair the session.
Thank you, Rabbi Konigsberg, for that introduction. Thank you to Magen Avot for spearheading what has been a really inspiring conference. We've learned so much. We've been inspired so much. We've brought so many together, and I'm really proud being the Rabbi of Muswell Hill Synagogue, and of course, along with Rabbi Harris at the Hampstead Synagogue, that we've been able to support you, Rabbi Konigsberg, and your community, along with other partners here today. It's been really so important. I know that for many people here at the moment, they might be thinking about another Mason, not Rabbi David Mason, but a Mason Mount at the moment, and thinking towards the upcoming match, of course, which we're all praying for a good result. But this, in some ways, is a really critical part of our conference, which is about consumer protest. In other words, how do we target effectively? A lot of our thoughts behind this conference is encapsulated by a saying in Ethics of the Fathers, Emor ma'at v'aseh harbe, say little but do much. We've been doing a lot of talking over the last 2 or so years about what is going on in Xinjiang. We've talked to friends of ours in the Uyghur community. And I know from my perspective, Rahima Mahmoud, who spoke earlier, has been a good friend, and as someone who's talked to myself, my family, and my community about what's going on, what is actually happening. There's been lots of talking about dibur, speech, finding out, awareness. Now is the moment of asiyah, of doing, of supporting protest, of supporting what goes on the ground. And I know that there's lots going on out there. We'll come back to that, of course, a little bit later. I just wanted to go through a really great panel that we have for you. And each of the members of our panel, from a different perspective, will talk about what's going on, what they contribute and what they feel are important ways to target actively protests on the ground. Firstly, we've got Bennett Freeman, who was previously served as Senior Vice President for Social Research and Policy of the Calvert Group, leading the social, environmental, and governance research, analysis, policy, and advocacy work of the largest family of socially responsible mutual funds in the US, based in Bethesda, MD. Bennett Freeman served in 3 positions, I think this is really critical here, as a Clinton presidential appointee in the State Department, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor from 1999 to 2001, with responsibility for bilateral human rights diplomacy. Now, I'm also going to introduce to you all Louisa Coan Greve. I'm really pleased you're with us. In fact, in Global Policy, I think it was, there was an article earlier this year, not long ago, by both Louisa and Bennett on the very issue of how we deal with the politics of dealing with China and the Uyghur genocide. Louisa is an expert in human rights and democratic governance, having worked 24 years at the National Endowment for Democracy. She has worked closely with hundreds of NGOs in 12 different countries, supporting them in their democracy building efforts. She now serves as Director of Global Advocacy at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. So really pleased that Louisa's with us too. We also have Mia Hasenson-Gross. Now, Mia is the director of Rene Cassin, which is a Jewish organization, the basis of which is the importance of a Jewish approach to human rights, a really special organization within Anglo Jewry, which works across the community and without the community, outside the community, and has itself a program on the Jewish reaction to the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims. Mia previously worked at Amnesty International as International Projects Advisor and acquired in-depth knowledge of international human rights work and experience. So it's really grateful, Mia, that you're with us. And Nina Freedman is with us. And we felt that a voice from our student body was really important. An activist student body is so important as part of our community. And Nina Freedman, who is the president of the Union of Jewish Students, was president at Bristol University of the Jewish Society there, studied a degree in English, graduated, and her journey has taken her to be president of the UJS. That's our panel today. And so what I'm going to do is ask each of you, if you can, to speak for between 5 and 7 minutes. That might leave time for some questions as well. You can, of course, send your question in. There's an email, hello@theus.tv. I think on Facebook, you can obviously, of course, write it in. But if you want to email hello@theus.tv, please do write your questions in. Without further ado, over to Bennett to start our panel.
Thank you. Rabbi Mason. It's appreciate the introduction. And I just want to thank Magen Avot and the other sponsors of this extraordinarily important and urgent conference. I'm delighted to be on this panel with my colleague, Louisa Greve, with whom I work together on the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor, and was delighted to hear the eloquent remarks on the first panel of our colleague, Rahima Mahmoud, and look forward not only to Louisa's remarks on this panel, but to Mia's and Nina's as well. I'll be brief, no more than 5 minutes, so maybe we can have time for questions here. And I know people are all thinking about the top of the next hour with the game about to get underway. I'm speaking not only as one of the members of the steering committee of the End Uyghur Forced Labor campaign, but also, as Rabbi Mason noted, as a former U.S. human rights diplomat, and since leaving the U.S. government now 2 decades ago, a international labor and human rights advocate. Who happens to be Jewish, and very proudly and resolutely so. I was moved by the remarks of the chief rabbi in his opening a couple of hours ago, pointing out so rightly that Jews have, quote unquote, a responsibility to stand up for others. That responsibility has indeed been an historical, ethical, moral, and indeed a political commitment of the Jewish community in the UK, in the US, and around the world. It's no accident that the plight of the Uyghurs has so urgently captured our attention and demanded our action. The plight of the Uyghurs has become increasingly apparent over the last couple of decades, but acutely so over the last couple of years, as serious allegations are now clearly established as absolute facts. Massive forced labor and incarceration, invasive surveillance, forced sterilization, cultural desecration. These are indeed the elements of genocide, as so many have pointed out, including President Biden. I want to pick up quickly on some of the comments made by the other speakers, particularly by Ian Duncan Smith, MP, as well as Alan Mendoza, about the geopolitical and diplomatic context here. As one who's been involved in the past in U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy, I have to say I was just so struck by how forcefully the Uyghur issue in general and the forced labor issue in particular was really at the forefront of the recent G7 summit hosted by the UK in Cornwall. And I was especially struck by how forceful and eloquent President Biden was in making clear that China must be held to account on the forced labor issue and indeed the other elements of the oppression of the Uyghurs that are so apparent. We have to move forward on the diplomatic front. We need to close the gap that's opened up where we've got the US, the UK, and Canada more explicitly acknowledging the depths and severity of the problem, the gap between those close allies and the EU and Japan. And I hope that in the coming months we can close that gap and have a more common front. That's going to take careful, painstaking diplomacy, both public and private diplomacy behind the scenes. But other forms of action. There's been mention in passing, and my colleague Louisa in a couple of minutes will be even more explicit than I in talking about the call to action as we've characterized it, that has been put forward beginning exactly a year ago by our coalition to end Uyghur forced labor, where we call on global apparel brands to sever entirely any connection whatsoever to Uyghur forced labor throughout their value chains. We've seen a number of significant commitments made by global brands to embrace the call to action and to take concrete, tangible, transparent steps to carry out the terms of the call to action. And I want to call out in particular two brands, UK brands, that have made that commitment explicitly. One is M&S, one of the great household names in the UK and much of the world, high streets all over. The other, less known but up and coming, is ASOS, who's also made that important commitment. I think that Louisa will probably call attention to the negative side of the ledger, those brands that have yet to either make the explicit commitment or to take those tangible steps. There's also been mention in the previous panel about the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics and the calls for boycott. And certainly we need to see, at the very minimum, a diplomatic boycott. And I think that will be forthcoming from the US, the UK, and other governments. And in that context, it's just so important that the resolution pending in the House of Commons next Thursday is passed. I do want to pick up also on the comments made by my fellow American, Kelly Currie. And it's notable that she and I are so closely aligned on this issue. She, a former Republican presidential appointee, and me, a former Democratic presidential appointee. And I think that our alignment on this issue and that of Ian Duncan Smith, a prominent conservative, and labor and the liberals, of course, demonstrate that both in the U.S., this is an issue that has commanded bipartisan consensus and support, and similarly cross-party consensus, and we hope full support in that resolution next Thursday. There was also mention made in the previous panel in passing to the important role that investors can play, and I can comment on that very quickly from my former vantage point as a leader in the responsible investment community in the U.S. for a number of years, and that is to say that investors are now focusing on this issue. Many labor and human rights issues command the attention of investors around the world, but the issue of the Uyghur forced labor, but the other elements of genocide that are imposed by Chinese government on the Uyghurs are now coming up rapidly, the agendas of responsible investors, at least on both sides of the Atlantic. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights has been very active in this regard, as have been several of the leading UK-based pension funds. So we need to push on all fronts here, as investors, as consumers, as citizens, as activists, to make clear that genocide, oppression, cultural desecration, forced labor are absolutely unacceptable in the 21st century, that we must have learned the lessons of history, the lessons that Jews have learned, the suffering that we've endured so horrifically in the 20th century, and not uniquely, and to take this stand of never again, but still now, there's so much to be done. So we all have our parts to play in one of the great political, moral, and economic imperatives of our time to take this common stand on this issue. And I'm just so grateful to the British Jewish community for taking such an important, urgent leadership role. Thank you.
Bennett, thank you so much for that. It is a complicated situation. The morality is clear. The Jewish approach is clear, and that's what's been so inspiring. But I think there also are so many different facets to how pressure can be brought on China from political, economic, financial perspectives. And in today's financial world, there's a lot of complications, a lot we need to learn. So to hear from you, Bennett, to open up that area, as with others, has been really helpful for us to take forward. And I think I would say that I know many here would feel that this conference is about taking things forward. It's about action that will come after. It's about where we go as members of communities from now. So Louisa, great to have you with us. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mason, for the introduction. I'd like to show you some images and specifically focus in on, as consumers, what can you do? So I invite everyone to contact me at the Uyghur-led organization I work for. Very proud to be serving a Uyghur advocacy group in the US, working closely with Rahima Mahmoud and other Uyghur organizations. So looking at the total technological surveillance, where is the corporate complicity here? We have lots and lots of press exposés going back to 2019 about the racial profiling, the Chinese government's use of Uyghurs as a literal laboratory of testing to develop AI using so much data input from surveillance cameras to apps to checkpoints. I want to just give you two household names. Huawei, much more of a household name, I believe, in Europe and the UK than the US. Huawei has openly said it's doing racial profiling, and then Hikvision. These two companies should absolutely be on the forbidden list for any ethical consumer and investor, as Ambassador Kelly and Bennett Freeman mentioned. Please remember these names, Huawei and Hikvision. and talk to any pension fund holder or investment advisor that has any retirement savings you have and say, I cannot hold these stocks in the emerging markets funds. And then with forced labor, we have extensive reporting, tremendous issues, not only in the Uyghur region, but across China, reported everywhere. And from household names like Nike, which has absolutely been hiding behind corporate speak, this is what they say. We have zero tolerance for forced labor. Of course, they say that it's required for access to the US market because forced labor imports are already illegal in the US and have been so for 90 years. And there's coming legislation in the UK. But the fact is, for consumers, likely 1 in 5 cotton garments in the global market are produced by state-organized forced labor of the Uyghurs. And so what can be done about it? Pay attention to the media coverage. Look at US government action as a starting place. We had an extraordinary case where 4 different US government departments issued a business advisory putting businesses on notice about their supply chains. And I want to commend the UK Parliament. 2 different subcommittees have looked at this issue, forced labor and UK value chains. So this is the coalition here, and I would just urge everyone, if you are able to look at the website, you just type in Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region that Rahima, Bennett, and others on this call and I are working on. And here you'll find actions, citizen actions, concerned consumer actions. You can use the hashtag forced labor fashion. And here are just some examples. Rene Cassin, just mentioned, is on this list. There's a big focus on Zara, which has, again, hidden behind corporate speak, zero tolerance for forced labor, but has done nothing to provide transparency about how it is providing cheap cotton garments without relying on slave labor of Uyghurs. There's a dedicated website, and so for those interested, what can I do? In addition to contacting your MPs, I would urge everyone to come to this website, forcedlaborfashion.org, and you can look at some of the gradings. So I'm showing you the first one here. Inditex is the owner of Zara. ASOS is on the good list, as Bennett mentioned. And so, kudos to one UK brand that has joined the very small number of fashion companies ready to show transparency and work with our coalition to have transparency and ensure that it is not using forced labor in its consumer offerings. But here you have Hugo Boss and Fila failing. So I urge you to look at these report cards, write to the corporate headquarters, use the one-click actions that you can find, for example, here. Something you can do 1 minute on social media, 5 minutes signing petitions, and in addition, going further and looking at the brand list. So you'll find this all at forcedlaborfashion.org. You can also help follow on Twitter, where you'll be able to see upcoming actions, share it with others, mobilize faith communities, trade unions, student groups, and everyone else who says, well, what can I do? Key in to some of the people who've been putting in a lot of work to research the brands and to really say which brands have done something and which have not. I'm a little ashamed to say, look, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, only 874 followers on this account. I'd love to say by the end of tonight, that should be 2,000. Let's have a campaign to say that's going to have 2,000 people, 1,000 of them in the UK, following this account and retweeting the contents to really spread awareness. Kelly Curry mentioned her own op-ed on the Olympics. So let's talk a little bit about the Olympics and, again, consumer action. This was Kelly's piece in the Wall Street Journal in March. You obviously know about the EU vote this week, and of course the upcoming UK vote, extremely important. But these are the consumer brands. These are the worldwide Olympic sponsors, none of whom have said anything publicly about their worries about being associated with Genocide Olympics. And there will be more actions coming along. If you follow the accounts I recently pointed to, you'll see more open and public pressure on these companies. Do they really want to stain their reputations of having been sponsors of what we are calling the Genocide Olympics. And finally, Mars, Snickers, if you can believe it. Well, it should be unremarkable, right? Coca-Cola is a sponsor. Snickers have gotten themselves named as the, quote, official chocolate of the Olympic Games. Mars, of course, claims the parent company, very proud of its ESG policies, its ethics, its forced labor, and all other ethical policies. And yet, there has to be a campaign to ask Mars, do you really want to be associated with the Games? There are petitions and actions, as Bennett mentioned, when people are really concerned, whether it's refuseniks or other atrocities across the world. So, you know, here we have Switzerland. Here we have, I actually can't remember where this is. I believe this is in Germany. There's action in the UK. If you want to follow what's happening with the Olympics, follow hashtag No Rights, No Games, or this Twitter account at No Rights, No Games. You can also follow No Beijing 2022 to stay up with continued action and consumer action that will be put out via these channels. And finally, to keep up with things with mostly a US focus, but also global, I invite you to visit the website of my organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and take a look at the possible actions. We're updating this frequently, and we invite you to take part. Thank you so much.
That's great, Louisa. Thank you so much. And I know the number of those following the hashtag has gone up already, and I've been following as well. So there'll be some more numbers on those accounts, which is great. Over now to Mia Hasenson-Gross from René, Cassin.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Magen, Avot, and United Synagogue for putting this brilliant event together. So René Cassin, like Rabbi Mason said, represents a community that's a speaker by experience. So we work in human rights issues, drawing on Jewish values and Jewish experience to really make sure that the Jewish community in the UK today responds to some of the more prevalent human rights challenges happening in the world today. It was 2.5 years ago where I first met Rahima, and apart from the fact that I got, I think, a friend for life, I heard the story of her family, what was happening to family, happening to her people. And I had this deja vu moment where I realized I heard this story before. It's the story of my family. It's the story of my people. And it made sense that René Cassin, together with the Jewish community, should become what it is today, one of the leading faith communities speaking out and acting to end the persecution of the Muslim Uyghurs. Today is the 26th anniversary of Srebrenica, where 8,000 men
Mia, I think you've muted yourself. We really want to hear you.
Sorry.
That's better.
Sorry, am I back? The other one is that we need to poke the beast. Eventually, that will have an effect. And as human rights activists, if it means poking the beast, then so be it. And there are several creative ways in which this can be done, and Bennett has explained some of them, and other speakers this evening. Speaking out and showing solidarity. We can only act if we know what's happening. 2.5 years ago, I didn't know what was happening to the Uyghurs. Very few in the Jewish community knew what was happening to the Uyghurs. But once we started speaking and raising awareness, and more individuals and community members and community leaders heard about what was happening, more action happened. Some of it was practical advocacy, political, commercial action. Others were acts of solidarity. The Jewish community has hosted several solidarity iftars with the Uyghur community here in the UK. We've shared Hanukkah lighting together. We've shared Pesach and our Seder plate together. We will celebrate Uyghur music and Uyghur food together. So it's raising awareness around the Uyghurs, who they are as a people, and with that, the persecution they're facing. We need to create a negative link between human rights violation and China. Chinese companies responsible for forced labor in their supply chain, or companies that have presence in Uyghur region, in East Turkestan. And just an example, Volkswagen is one of those companies that both has presence in Uyghur region, but also in its supply chain is complicit with the use of Uyghur forced labor. So it was a month ago where we organized an international day of action outside Volkswagen dealerships. And some workers in these dealerships were horrified with what they learned. Others got angry, but the point is that that became an issue and people were talking about it. And cars that were driving past these dealerships saw these signs saying, "Stop the persecution, close the concentration camps. Volkswagen must cease any operations in a region that's killing its people." So that is happening. We heard about consumer choices and high street brands that source cotton from Uyghur region or products made from that cotton. So for some of us, it's having challenging conversations with our 15-year-old daughters on why half of the high street is now off limits until these companies make the ethical choice of changing their operations and explicit commitments. Others get inspired. And we had a Rene Cassin supporter who saw the list of these 87 companies. He realized that actually a shop of, a brand of shirts that he really likes wasn't on the list, but he decided to approach them anyway. And cutting a long story short, after months on conversations, that brand has now made a commitment to close down its factory in Xinjiang region. Now, is it that individual's sole influence that achieved that? I'd like to think it is. I think every little counts. But I think there's definitely, there are definitely individual choices that we can make. We mentioned the Olympics and the fact that the International Olympic Committee has granted a Chinese company known to be using Uyghur forced labor, the official contract to produce official Olympic merchandise. So again, making those choices. We heard of companies that are sponsors of the Olympics. If it's Snickers and Mars or Coca-Cola or Visa, we need to challenge their decision. It's not so much about calling for complete boycott of the Olympics, but like all the speakers here and the motion that will be voted for on Thursday in the UK Parliament, it's about a diplomatic boycott. In 1935, a year before Germany was due to host the 1936 Olympics, the UK government refused to back an appeal by British athletes to Adolf Hitler to mark the games by freeing imprisoned Jewish athletes and other incarcerated for racial or religious reasons. The Nazi regime managed to convince everyone that it would be celebrating and upholding human rights values. Let's remember that when it was granted the Olympic Games back in 1931, Germany was a republic. But when the Nazis seized power and began interning Jews 2 years later, the International Olympic Committee refused to openly criticize the treatment of the Jews for fear of irritating the host. It's happening now today. We must not fear from irritating the beast. We must poke the beast, take the diplomatic steps that are needed, the consumer individual steps from having a difficult conversation to making those choices when we're facing or in the high street and we need to decide which garments we want to purchase and shops we want to support. But going back to my first point, it's about speaking out. It's about making known what is happening, so that when people, for example, hear about these brands or hear about the Olympics, they're not a celebration for China, but they'll be in our conscious known as the genocide games, because that is what they are. And Nike and all those brands that have not taken the steps and made the commitment to end being complicit to what China is committing against the Uyghurs in Uyghur region, and that should be known. But the immediate thing that we all need to do now is really lobby our individual MPs. The motion to call on diplomatic sanctions on the Olympics is going to be voted on Thursday. You now have the link. Please, once you enter it, you can know why you need to support it, but also you can link directly to your MP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you very, very much. And now over to Nina to finish up our panels. Nina, we're a little bit tight for time, but we really want to hear from you. So and of course, you know what's coming too.
Yeah.
But great.
Hi, I'm Nina, the president of the Union of Jewish Students. I first want to say a huge thank you to the organisers of the event today. I've been watching for the past couple of hours and I've been really impressed by the calibre of speakers that we have had. But more than anything, I'm really impressed by everyone's passion and heart. And I think for us to mobilise our community in this way is really something special and something I hope we can continue to do to support those in need around the world. Now, I can't profess to know as much as some of my fellow panellists about consumer protest, but I'm here to talk a bit about Jewish student activism around the Uyghur crisis. So Jewish students are very passionate and there is a real appetite for social activism among them. And for the past year, we at UJS have been focused on the Uyghur crisis because many students identified with the cause and it was close to their hearts because of the history of oppression of our own people. And we took up the cause as the first major communal organisation in the UK to vocally raise awareness of this issue. And that kind of, I think, shows you a trend. You know, young people are often the ones that are the most vocal. We're the ones putting ourselves out there. And it's a really good example of why we should always listen to our youth, because I think we do know the best sometimes. So what is it that we're doing to help? Jewish student activism has come in two forms, and I think there's a lot we can learn from how our students have taken this up. Firstly, in terms of direct action, we at UJS, in partnership with René Cassin, created letter templates that Jewish students could send to their local MPs. And this letter highlighted the severity of the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China and focused on the specific Jewish student perspective, which was their moral duty, their commitment to interfaith action, and their personal connections to genocide through the Holocaust. The letter also asked MPs to commit to 5 pledges, including demand for an investigation, boycotts of products produced by Uyghur slave labour, and imposing sanctions against China. We had around 150 students accessing, personalising, and sending this letter on to their MPs, which demonstrated the breadth of interest on this topic. And in terms of large-scale activism, we learned from this that the best way to engage large numbers is to make it as simple and accessible as possible. We helped our students to make a difference and do active work to not be complicit, but we didn't demand too much of their time or effort, which allowed us to engage huge numbers. The main part of our activism, though, has come in the form of social media awareness raising. With the onset of COVID, our social media engagement increased hugely, and we capitalised on this in order to raise general awareness of the crisis. One way we did this was through a panel with young Uyghur Muslim students and activists in the UK who spoke about their culture and experience. And I personally think this was really powerful because it helped to humanise the victims of this genocide rather than just kind of presenting them as a faceless group of people. And we held many large-scale awareness-raising events in this vein. And our goal throughout has always really been to platform the people that truly understand this crisis and those who are most affected by it. I think it's great for us to get involved as a Jewish community, but we should recognise the continual importance of giving a voice and a platform to those who really need it. Alongside this, we encouraged our JSOCs to run their own localised events, and this combination of centralised and localised activity helped to empower individual JSOCs and individual student activists, and allowed us to work towards a campaign that puts students at the heart of our activism, as they are at the heart of everything we do as an organisation. Now, I'm someone who firmly believes that our young people should be our role models, our shining examples for how we want our community to look. And I would urge everyone to look to our youth. and talk about the causes that they are passionate about. In my mind, if the community were as passionate as engaged as our youth, we would be in a much better place, and perhaps we could take more action on the issues that are important. The worst thing that we can possibly be is complicit, and I know that Jewish students especially are not willing to take this one lying down. So over the coming year, I hope to continue the amazing work of my predecessors. I've only actually been in this role for a couple of weeks now, but I'm hoping to continue what UJS have been doing over the past year and continue to stand up for what Jewish students think is right. We will be continuing our work to raise awareness and not to stand by as these atrocities are perpetrated against the Uyghur population. Hopefully, by working together as a community and as a people, we can ensure that never again will actually become a reality. Thank you.
Excellent. That was superb. Thank you so much, Nina. And I think we've learned so much from all of our panel now. We're going to hand over now to Rabbi Kenigsberg to give us some final comments, but it's been a real pleasure to learn from our panel and from everyone today, actually. Over to you, Rabbi Kenigsberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Mason. Thank you to all of our panelists, to all of our speakers, to all of our moderators this evening. It has been extraordinary. It's been an extraordinary event, and I really just want to thank again all those who've worked so hard to make this a reality. In particular, I want to give thanks to Julian Pollard and to Baraksina and to the whole team at Magen Avot, without whose dedication and commitment in driving this forward simply would not have happened tonight. I want to thank as well our generous sponsors, Michael Storfer, Baruch Zakaria, Paul Taylor, and Melvin Kay. And of course, I want to thank all of you. Thank all of you for joining us tonight, for watching this conference, for caring enough to take the time to learn about what is happening and to take the time to think about what we can do moving forward. I think there's one sentence that was said tonight that really stands out for me. We've heard so many things, but one sentence that we heard in the first panel: the world says never again, but it's happening again. And it's not too late to act. This evening, we've heard from faith leaders, we've heard from MPs, former UN diplomats, legal experts, human rights activists. We've spoken about the religious imperative. We've spoken about the moral duty. And we've spoken about ways to effect change through letter writing, through effective consumer behavior, through political protest, through websites and hashtags that can help us find those practical steps that we can take. We've spoken about the statements that we can make in person and on social media, and of course through prayer. This is not the end of the conversation. This is merely the beginning. We pray and hope that together we can and that we will make a change. And we know it may take time, but we cannot and we will not give up. It is my fervent hope that this conference tonight will join with other steps that are being taken and become a catalyst to end the Uyghur genocide, to usher in a brighter future for the Uyghur people and for all of humanity. We conclude tonight by pledging to continue to do all that we can to move from anguish to action and to a better future. Thank you all for being with us tonight.